Hello and welcome. Happy Wednesday. It's great to see everyone start joining. I'm going to give you a minute just while we wait for people to get situated and connected. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch our first poll. And if you've attended one of our webinars before, this may look familiar, but we're always curious to know what's bringing you to today's webinar specifically. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your TPRM program? Maybe a current prevalent customer? Just, let me know. Let's begin by getting some intros started. My name is Melissa. I work here in business development. And if you've been to any of the last 4 webinars, you've probably seen me here. But today we are joined by our very own CMO, Mike Yaffe. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
And then our CEO and founder of Cyber Marathon Solutions, Bob Wilkinson. Hi, guys.
Hi, everyone.
So today, Bob's going to be guiding us through today's topic, how to scale your third-party risk management program in difficult economic times. This webinar is being recorded, as you can see, so you'll get this along with the slideshow in your inbox later today or tomorrow, depending on your time zone. And then lastly, you're all muted. So, if you do have to say something pressing, use the chat, but if it is a Q&A, throw it in the Q&A box so we can, attack that when we need to. And without further ado, I will let Bob jump into it. Go ahead.
Okay, so the format that we're going to use today is actually that Mike's going to be interviewing me, and I'm going to be talking about the impact of economic difficult times, recession, can have on a third-party risk management program and how it's important to focus on some very specific topics in light of that. So without further ado.
It's a good picture, Bob. The lighting was good in that one. I'm already teasing about the lighting because right before we got on the phone, everybody, I'm like, Bob, you're too dark. Everybody wants to see your bright shining face. So he just moved a light right before the call. So I'm very happy with the lighting. So I think we did a good job. Guys, look, if you have any questions, Bob has been doing this for 20, 30 years. He has, and he's not going to introduce himself, but I will. He's established a lot of third-party risk programs at major brands that everybody would recognize, credit card companies, banks. He's been doing this for a while. One of the foremost experts in this. So when he talks, most people listen, right? So we're super lucky to have him. 2 things. If you have questions, feel free to use the QA chat function. I will try to get to them in real time. If not, we'll pull them to the end. And 2, I do live in Boston. I know I have a Dodgers jersey there. People ask. Got to hang out with Kirk Gibson, hit one of the 5 most famous home runs. So hopefully you know who that is. But without ado, why don't we get right into it, Bob? So look, first question that we talked to is, what do you need to do? What should you be focusing on? Look, there's layoffs. Amazon just laid off 10,000 people. Twitter did. It clearly has to do with higher recession rates, the economy rebalancing itself out, but it's the reality that we live in now. So, I'm sure people are thinking about, so how do I do this? How do I get through a TPRM program? How do I scale it when I'm heading into next year if there's going to be challenges?
Okay, Mike, thanks. That's really seems to be the burning question of the moment, particularly with the large number of tech layoffs that we're seeing and the ripple effects it's having, all the way down to the effects that it's having on startup companies and how funding for a lot of startups is drying up, and how it's no longer an acceptable business model to be having hyper growth if you're burning through money. You actually have to show some kind of profitability. And for companies with pristine balance sheets, yeah, you can get funding, but the world has changed. So there's a few things that I'd like to talk about as far as, things to focus on during a recession.
Bob, can I ask you a question? You just brought up a really good point. When you have these trickle down, so you have a layoff at Amazon, okay, Amazon's not going out of business, but it generally trickles down, right? So then doesn't this either on the supplier or the risk side, whatever you want to talk about, doesn't that introduce more risk because of a downturn economy, right? It might make a business less stable. They might have a more difficult time doing fulfillment. They might not be the same supplier that they were if they're also suffering from lower business, fewer employees. They can't fulfill as a supplier to the upstream business as they did before, right?
That's in fact exactly one of the key things that we need to be aware of as we go forward in this environment. The example that I'll use is a unicorn company that I know and deal with, that I was having a discussion with recently, told me how some of the smaller suppliers in the space that they operate in are calling them up and saying, hey, would you like to buy us? You know, case in point, funding's drying up. And when you get to that position, one of the key things you need to focus on is the financials of those third parties that you consider critical to your business operations, because financials can degrade very quickly in this environment. And you just have to be really sensitive to that fact. You have to keep up to date. You have to look for deteriorating financial trends.
So how often should you be assessing the risk because look, there's IT operational risk, but then there's the financial risk on the supplier, right? We'll have some procurement and IT people, but now I'm just thinking about like, how often should you be evaluating the overall stability of a tier one supplier?
Well, the short answer is every day, but as a practical matter, the challenge and the migration that we're seeing in how things operate within companies, we need to be focused on an ongoing basis to the risk that's going on in companies, but we need to do that in a more holistic way. We need to focus not just on financials, because financials are one aspect of it, but we also need to focus on compliance. And compliance is something that can change very quickly. And when I talk about compliance, I'm talking about not just rules and regulations like anti-bribery and corruption or AML. I'm also focused on what might be going on with the company in terms of negative news. So negative news on one of your suppliers has a ripple effect of negative news on your brand. So you need to focus on that. But in an environment where there are financial pressures from the economy on companies, that's also a heightened environment for regulatory focus. So regulators will say, are you making the investments you need to make to properly manage and mitigate risk? Because when you enter into this environment, budgets get cut, but regulations don't. And we're at a moment now on the cusp of new regulatory guidance being issued, both in the US, in Canada, and also in Europe. And these regulations are going to have a financial impact, as they always do.
So Bob, what in a nutshell, like who do they affect? Everybody? Everybody does third parties? Is it financial? Like just give us the Cliff Notes version of what's coming.
Well, primarily, and this comes back to financial because financial is the most regulated sector. So and from that perspective, this is going to hit financial particularly hard. But what happens in financial is really the trendsetter for what's going to happen across all industry that you need to be aware of. So particularly with the financials, you're going to start to see legislation emerging around ESG. So for example, one of the draft OCC regulations is the climate impact on financial institutions, where it talks about what is the impact on institutions where they do their lending today? Are you lending a lot of mortgage money to places that are very
not lending as much as they were, right?
Yeah. But and certainly not at the rate they were from a financial perspective. But the point being that companies' portfolios are going to be impacted by changing climate, and both in the short term and in the longer term. And when you look at that, for example, in the US, some of the longer term impacts of climate are banks that are lending in areas where climate is going to have a bigger impact are going to have to explain to the regulators how they're addressing the impact on low-income communities where climate change is having a bigger impact. So we get into discussions of fair lending and things like that. So financials are primary, but also look at what the Biden administration has done with China and the export of chips. So high-end chip technology, there are restrictions being put in place in export of that technology to China, which is going to have impacts on the semiconductor chip makers. So you're going to see that combined with directives on the government side, particularly on the military side, where you have to have detailed knowledge of your supply chain, and you have to ensure that certain entities in certain countries are nowhere in your supply chain down to the manufacturer of the smallest chip. And that's the DoD national budget, I think it's 997, where there's specific restrictions on what companies can do with certain suppliers.
So going to the next question. So look, what I'm hearing is reassess risk, ensure that you're checking every day, especially as there might be some economic conditions that affect your suppliers or vendors. So what's the recommendation for the folks who are listening? How do you do this with leaner declining budgets and headcount, right? Or you don't get the heads next year to scale your third-party program.
Right. So remember, you have to focus on what's most critical to you. And you also have to take into consideration for
Bob,
those
do you want to
critical.
advance the slide too, just so people?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
There we go.
So what you want to do is you want to make sure you have the right mix of third parties, that you have sufficient redundancy in your supply chain, and that when you're monitoring things like financials, if you see degradation, you're not waiting for things to fall apart before you start planning should you need to consider an exit. You have to think of these things in advance. Now, from an economic perspective, and I've been a big advocate of this all along, is whenever your business comes to you and wants to use a new supplier, the first question you need to ask is, do you have a supplier who already does that for you? Because if you do, you've already done your due diligence, you already have a contract in place. It's just a matter of expanding the relationship, and it makes it more financially efficient using a supplier you already have. And you are decreasing risk because you are sharing less of your information, less of your network and infrastructure access with third parties. So that's an important aspect of it. The other is how you automate your supply chain risk management activities. If you're still sending out Excel questionnaires to your third parties to get your risk assessments done, that ship sailed a long time ago. You have to look at automation and what technology can do for you and how you're going to leverage that to be more efficient in the operation of your program. So those are important considerations there.
Right on. Bob, let's skip this one. We'll come back to this. Okay. I think the next question actually ties. So based on your past experience, right? We were talking about this during our prep call. Right. I remember when the market crashed and I was just starting, right? But in 2001, then there was the 2008 housing crisis. Look, it's cyclic. Every 7 years it happens, the economy bounces back. But what are the lessons here? Because you've seen this type of stuff go down while working in third party. So, what's the advice here? Mine would be first, stay calm, right? It's the Animal House. I don't know how many of you have seen. Stay calm. There's nothing to see here. Stay calm. There's nothing to see.
Yes, you get run over by the herd.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly. So, there's the first point I would make is that third-party risk management can have a significant contribution to cost savings when the pressure's on. And I'll tell you a story. In a past life, when I was part of a vendor management committee of a large financial institution, and 2009 happened, the Great Recession, we were looking across the organization on how we might be able to save money. So part of that involved looking at all of the third parties we were using, the contracts, the master service agreements that we had in place. In the case of one major technology provider, as we delved deeply into this, we found out we had 8 master service agreements with that particular technology provider.
That's crazy, by the way.
All priced differently. So you can imagine that the call we had with that technology company was very interesting. We're going to have one agreement. We're going to have one price. Net, by doing that, by reviewing the relationships we have and understanding where we're duplicating services unnecessarily, we were able to save in the course of that year $100 million out of our budget for third parties. So that is an important factor in how we manage third-party risk when we're in a situation where financials are important.
I will say though, Bob, and look, I guys didn't introduce myself. There's not much to it, but I've been in information security marketing for 22 years. So you pick up a few things, right? So I know enough to be dangerous. I don't know, a fraction of what Bob does, but it does feel like, look, when you have security teams, they're typically thought of as a cost center and risk avoidance. I feel like finding that, savings, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't happen all the time, but it's avoiding on the front end as you onboard somebody, a vendor that could potentially disrupt your business, right? Where you don't know that a key part for a car is being made in the Ukraine and now nothing's coming in and out of the Ukraine. You have visibility into those things. Or on the IT side, these vendors aren't doing proper IT security and they're accessing your data and they're introducing a risk. So look, I know it's third-party risk management, but it does feel like security and risk is always, it's a cost center, but a necessary cost of doing business. I mean, how do you think of it? Am I off?
No, it is a cost of doing business, and certainly the regulation behind it drives the need to address it. But it's also an opportunity to help focus the business proactively in terms of the relationships that they have. The point I made about before you onboard anybody, look and see if you have someone who's already doing that. So it doesn't have to be the situation where third party is a source of unending cost growth. Because the other factor you have to look at is organizations on average, and this is anecdotal, not scientific, organizations may grow 10% a year in the number of third parties they have. Nobody is funding 10% budget increases for third-party risk based on the fact that your number of third parties is growing 10% a year.
And look, and I say this all the time. This is marketing. This is everything else. Yeah, fine. Prevalence sells a platform. I get it, but you have to be able to automate and scale. It doesn't have to be. There's a lot of places. You might have a GRC. They have modules. We have modules. There's a lot of places to go, is what I'm saying. But you have to be able to prioritize your vendors, identify who they are, figure out their level of priority, and figure out what the heck you're going to do to validate them as a good fit for your business, right? I mean, that's in a nutshell.
That's what you have to do. But remember that the unfettered growth in the number of third parties that you have, you look at particularly at larger organizations got large both through organic and inorganic growth. They made acquisitions. Tell me the number of companies that have made acquisitions that have a process in place to go through and rationalize all of the third parties that came with the deal.
Yeah, it's an after.
And I'll tell you, I could count on one hand, the number of companies I've seen where they've even attempted to do that. So there's a lot of inherent inefficiency in the process. So how do you attack that? How do you get at that? And between the growth, between the acquisitions, between all of it, you just have far more third parties that I would argue you realistically need.
So go back to slide 8. Now it fits, right? Which is, sorry, we're jumping around, folks, but this is how we do it. Right? So you identify a vendor. You're like, we need to buy widget X or Y. What should you really be doing when you onboard them?
Okay. So onboarding, for me, always starts with one question. Do you have somebody who already does it? It has to start with that question, because that gets at the core issue, which is the unfettered growth. So that's part number one. The second part is, instead of jumping in and doing an assessment right away, you ask the third party if they have an independent risk assessment that's already been completed in the last 12 months, for example. And then you don't have to do the risk assessment. You get what's current and available, and you can make an assessment based on that. The biggest problem that companies, that businesses have with their third-party risk management process is how long it takes to get through an onboarding. Everybody has to wait for all the assessments to do. If you're a large banking organization, you may have to go through 5, 10. I've even heard examples where you have to go through 20 assessments before somebody can make a decision to onboard a company. And at a certain level, it's overkill. And it's the difference between managing risk and ensuring compliance.
It's got to work for the business too. Look, I used to, people 10 years ago would talk about multi-factor, right? When you get your phone and that 6-digit code, they're like, people aren't going to do that, or they don't want security to risk get in the way. You can't be the Department of No, by the way, right? Or find reasons not. It has to, a CSO I used to work with, used to work at, I was in the Pacific Northwest, a healthcare thing. He used to tell me, he's like, look, what my job is to say, look, we can either accept the risk, deny the risk, or we explain the risk to the board, right? And say, there's a mitigation strategy, but it's going to cost more. If we do it at this level, it's this. If we deny it, okay, because of X, Y, and Z, but it has to function within the business, right? It can't, you know what I mean, Bob? It can't be.
We are the secure enablers of the business opportunity, and anybody who says anything else misses the point.
Agreed.
I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a room and here are the no police. No, here are the enablers of your business opportunity. And that's what we're there to do. That's how we do it. And you talk about the different risks. You can remediate risk, you can accept risk, and you can transfer risk. And the classic case for transferring risk is cyber insurance. But when you accept risk as a business person, you have to sign off on that risk, and you have to define the compensating controls that you're going to use by accepting that risk. And there are times where business units want to assume risk which is beyond the scope of their business and will affect the whole organization. And those are the times when people who work in security have to say no. So you have to understand the risk, and you have to educate the business on what that risk is. And then you have to say, if you're going to accept risk, what are your compensating controls? It just can't be blindly accepted.
Agreed. And, it's funny, I was talking to somebody today. I want to do another topic next year on, who are the business, and I guess it's probably different, but probably somewhat similar. Who are the lines of business folks that you need to kind of talk to and understand, say, hey, look, we're onboarding vendors. I would like us as a team to work together to understand and agree on a set of criteria, if that's the right word, for bringing on a vendor without it being overly burdensome, but fair and reasonable to our business. And quite frankly, if they're a tier 1 vendor that you're relying on for core functionality, I do think more stringent set of assessments and continuous monitoring is reasonable and warranted. But so who do you need to kind of work with internally? Who are the teams that you're like, look, in every case, you always have to talk to X, Y, and Z and get them on.
Right. Well, I think that there's a few things there, Mike, and you need to think about how you build relationships with those other stakeholders in the process. And what I would focus on first is your procurement organization, because they're the funnel through which RFIs and RFPs get generated to identify third parties. Or when a business knows who they want to work with, they have to work with the procurement organization to get all the logistics done. You have to consider the legal function, because at the end of the day, you need a contract in place. So you have to consider that. One of the functions that I focus on is helping those people responsible for risk management in your organization understand how you're managing third-party risks. And by that, I mean operational risk management and enterprise risk management, because they can be, by keeping them informed, one of your strongest supporters and sponsors when things particularly get tough, by explaining both to senior management and the board that risk mitigation is a critical activity that just because things are getting tight in the economy, we can't neglect.
So why do procurement people want to, what's the win for the procurement person? I'm a third party risk person. I'm going to the procurement people and say, hey, look, I know you might have onboarded this, but now I'm doing an IT security review of the vendor. And I'm asking, is the win that you're like, look, we can really validate that this is a tier 1 vendor, is great from a business and a technical capability to support us? Is that the win for the procurement people, that it gives them more confidence?
The procurement people are under enormous pressure to get deals done for the business. Time is of the essence. They hear from the business might say, well, I'm going to sign next week a contract with tier 1 vendor A. And, and they're just letting the third party risk team know that, or even after the fact, as it happens sometimes. The ability to have a good line of communication with procurement to make things happen quickly on behalf of the business. At the end of the day, the reason we're in business is to make businesses successful and to get the heck out of the way with the deals that they want to do as quickly as we can. So the primary win for procurement is supporting them in the efficient processing of onboarding of third parties.
So make it go faster, better, more secure.
Faster.
Right. Faster
while doing what you need to do to comply with law and regulation.
Okay.
And risk.
So it's compliance, it's speed, it's greater level of depth in terms of information on that vendor, especially when it's a tier 1. So they can feel better about getting better, and I'm just making stuff up, better info more quickly.
Right. And that's the key mechanism for how companies get onboarded is through the procurement process. And now there are these checks and balances that we describe as third-party risk management, how that third-party risk management works together with procurement in support of the business to help them realize their goals as quickly as possible. But at the same time, applying a dose of common sense to say, can we use somebody we already have? How can we make this more efficient? And the other part that comes with that is, how can we automate the process of onboarding and streamline it and move companies that we do want to have relationships with into our continuous monitoring processes more quickly?
Makes sense. Guys, and just for you out there, if you have any questions, if you want to ask something in real time, I'm happy to do it. If you want to wait to the end or just keep listening, I get it, no worries. But we'll absolutely try to get them. I've been checking the chat function. So far, nobody's sending anything. We must have them enthralled, Bob. So why don't we jump to slide 14? We've talked about this a lot. You're adding 10% more vendors. TPRM, people are either being asked to formalize a program and like, look, if you're doing a spreadsheet right now, and I'm sure people are laughing, you're like, I wish I even had a spreadsheet, right? So I'm sure there are people who are just sending out a few emails, maybe a spreadsheet, but if you're doing that, you're behind at this point. But if you're adding more vendors, if your business is doing stuff, oh, hey, Melissa, Sam, one of our guys is on the webinar, just texted. He said, it says the chat function is disabled. I don't know if it is or isn't, but thank you for letting me know, Sam. This is real time. This is real time. Hey, you got to do it.
Let's see if I can adjust some settings here, but I know the Q&A function is working, so please feel free to use that in the meantime.
So we do that too, but I didn't want to miss any important questions. So
no, that's great.
Sam, thanks for the heads up. This is where my ADD kicks in, and it's fantastic because I can do all these things. Oh, Shu, I just got your chat. We're good. So Bob, people are adding more vendors. You're doing a bunch of stuff like that. How do you deal with it? How do you keep up? Like full well, let's just say you can't treat all vendors equally, and it's okay to say, like, look, with the people and the tech and the budget spend, this is what we can reasonably achieve. I mean, that's where I would start, but why don't you flip over to the next slide and then we can.
Right. So, part of it is, being proactive, and how you build your inventory becomes an important question there. Do you understand what you even have? And how can you make that available to people to leverage what exists? The other part of this is being proactive and reaching out to your business partners periodically to say, what's coming down? Are you looking at bringing new third parties on, at least for your critical business activities? Now, part of that you could meet with the business, but businesses at the end of the day are responsible for managing the relationships that they outsource. And this is not something that is talked about a lot, but it's a critical point. Businesses can outsource functionality, but they cannot outsource responsibility and accountability. And in fact, by regulation, businesses are required, for example, in banking, to do quarterly performance assessments documented of their third-party relationships. So if a regulator comes in to do an exam, they can say to you, okay, so where are your documented performance reports for the last year on third-party A, third-party B, and third-party C? And if you don't do that, you're not complying with regulation. So there's a need to have a clear relationship management function within businesses that are responsible for owning that relationship. So when third-party risk does an assessment and we identify issues, we should not be necessarily the ones chasing the vendor to fix it. That should be done by someone in the business who owns the relationship with that third party. And that's an important differentiator.
So we just got a really great question from, hold please, sorry, just looking at all the questions now, they're coming in. Eugene, we'll give us Eugene, great question. He says he's been in procurement for 20 years and they're rewarded by savings and not risks mitigated. Bob, what's your comment on that?
Well, that is true, but at the same time, risks that are unmitigated are much more expensive to an organization than any savings they might achieve.
That's what I would say, where I was at too, right? If you bring on a crappy vendor, quite frankly, because you don't look at the risks and then they flame out.
It's not even flaming out,
they get hacked. Or they get hacked, or you have to resource a vendor, or the vendor introduces risk because there wasn't. I hear what you're saying, but I think there has to be some. I always joke about our sales guys that comp plans drive behavior. And Eugene, I get it. If your sole focus is, your comp is 100% tied to how much money do you save or how much can you beat down a potential vendor, then that's what I would do too. But it seems to be missing a whole side of the Rubik's Cube, for lack of a better, right? Where Bob, where you're like, the cost of having a breach or having a vendor and, flame out in the middle, and then having I keep using the example, your car part not be delivered and you can't build BMWs is a little bit more challenging, right?
Well, there are commodity relationships which are driven by price and beating people down on price. And then there are strategic relationships that should be built on trust, and that there is a value opportunity, a gain share to be had by both parties in the relationship. And one of the things that you should focus on in a third-party risk management program is your outreach to your third parties, at least your critical third parties, and how you build relationships of trust with them. Because when you build relationships of trust, they are more willing to share with you, and the relationship is more beneficial to both parties. So focusing on just beating third parties down on cost, if that's an organization's directive and you're in that procurement role, that's going to drive your behavior, but that is a short-sighted behavior, which ultimately can end up costing more. That's what I would say to that. So you want to be driven by cost? That's fine. You're going to get bit by regulation. You're going to end up paying the money back, and you don't get the full value out of the relationships with the companies you have.
Bob, a lot of people, no, I think that's a great answer, and I think it's right. I do, right? And you don't want to swing the pendulum so far where, again, right, you got 20 things you got to do on the procurement or sourcing side, but there should be some happy medium. Bob, talk about, I have, since I joined Prevalent, I've been here 4 years, I have felt very strongly that the way procurement and IT security are successful is getting language in contracts, right up front, and saying we have the right to assess, we have the right to monitor, we have the right to, quite frankly, demand or require remediative activities in the event that you are deemed deficient. Where are you on that? And I know it's not even in here, but I wanted to ask.
Yeah. Well, contracts is a big deal, and how you approach them is really important. I mean, there are certain things that you need to have in there, both for good business practice and because also regulation requires it. So the big three are the right to audit, which is basically, yes, you agree that I could perform a risk assessment on your company. Breach notification, when there's a data breach, you want them to notify you as soon as possible, 24, 48 hours tops, of when they become aware of a breach. But remembering with breaches that the time between an organization being compromised and discovery of the breach is on average 270 days. So that means somebody's in your network for a long time surfing around doing damage. So you want breach notification. And the third thing is you want to compel your third parties to remediate issues that are found. Third-party risk management is exactly that. It's risk management. It's not third-party compliance, or we would call it that. Yeah. Risk management means when you find issues, when you assess and you identify them, that you fix and remediate them. Otherwise, quite frankly, don't bother doing a risk assessment. Don't bother having a third-party risk program, because if you don't fix the things you find, you're not managing risk at the end of the day.
Hey, Bob, and this has been something that has plagued security, and just because I'm old, right? But it's, I came from a vulnerability management and penetration testing background, right? The vulnerability management is when you scan the outside of a network and look for potential holes, report on them, then see if you can do some proactive hacking, hack yourself, right? To see if there's a real vulnerability. You would discover tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. Do you know how many that the server team might address in any given month? 2, 3, but they would address them. But it even took a while for them to agree to sit down at the table and have a conversation. I think you absolutely have to be pushing. And Bob, if you would go right over to slide 18, this kind of slides right in there, but you have to be able to enforce a fix. If you're just sitting there and, I get that a lot of it's compliance, but to do this the right way, which is what we preach a lot here, right? Where you can actually have a significant positive impact, you got to be able to affect change.
Right, and
So,
the way you affect change, one way you can affect change that I find particularly effective is you report on the identified issues by business, share that with the business and give them the opportunity to fix it or to come up with the plans and the dates by which they will fix it. And then you share it with management. And no business will want to show up with their senior management as the one who never gets issues for third party remediated. That is a big red flag. That is a carrot and stick approach. You share the issue report before it's published or shared with anybody else, with the businesses, and ask them what they're doing to remediate. If they don't remediate, they're the ones who are going to be called, and nobody wants to be at that level called out in front of their peers.
yeah,
That's just the fact.
You got to just shine light on it and say, this is a risk.
That's what it is.
Right? And I've addressed this, and is there a little CYA element to it? But I've addressed this, and here's the potential solution. Now, we can either choose to proceed or not, but it's your job to call out the risks, folks.
Right, and it's not just calling them out, and it's not just tracking the plan, because what happens is people come up with a corrective action plan, which invariably is the end date of a quarter or the end date of the year. So I find a critical vulnerability right now, and somebody tells me they're going to fix it June 30th next year. Okay, that's your plan. I'm going to come back every few months and ask you for progress on that, because I know if I wait to June 30th, it'll just end up being a retarget. That's part of the game. Or close out the issue and open a new one with a new target date. So there's a whole bunch of ways that people try to game that system, none of which I think are valid or am a fan of. So it's not just shining the light, it's shining the light and checking back before the date it's due to make sure that progress is actually being made.
Yep. I'm going to read something from Kevin. It feels like he's in violent agreement, but I'm going to read it, Bob. Why don't you flip to the next slide while we're doing it? The entire reason for TPRM is to populate the right to audit paragraph with justification and examples of the need to evaluate during the initial assessment and reassessment, and then list the unmitigated findings with an agreed upon SLA for full remediation, or have the ability to exit the relationship.
Agree. That's absolutely a way to summarize it, because if it's in the contract that the third party has to remediate identified issues within an acceptable and agreed upon time frame, then that's a violation of contract terms if they don't do it. And it does give you the leverage if that's the way they want to go. I can't believe third parties like to do that, but there are always cases where they say too bad. And then you have to make a judgment call whether you really want to do business with those people. So, and people who argue about those clauses up front when you're negotiating a contract, you have to wonder what they're going to do when the rubber meets the road and things do need to be fixed.
Yeah, why? I mean, that should be like, we want to work in concert and we want to work together, right? If you're objecting to that, to me, it's not a red flag, but it's at least something to maybe pay a little bit more attention to.
Exactly. It certainly is. And, in any third-party risk program, you have to have a balance between what you need to do to manage risk and what you need to do for compliance purposes. When regulations are passed, and we're going to see new regulations on third-party risk come out in the US in the not too distant future, how are we going to ensure we're compliant with those regulations? But remember, compliance does not equal risk management. And just ticking a box and saying, I did my assessment. And I know large organizations that do this. Well, it stops after I complete the assessment because I was able to tick the box. That's not the point of the program. The point of the program is effectively mitigating and managing risk. Hard stop. That's what it's about.
You can do it, but it takes a little effort, but that's the job, right? I mean,
it really is the job.
At the end of the day, it's not compliance checklist. It's not like I did it, my auditor certified it.
That's why leveraging the other people in the organization, such as the enterprise risk function, and working closely with them, they are a lever for you to use to help in this conversation with the business to get things remediated. Because if enterprise risk says the job isn't getting done and things aren't getting remediated, they're reporting to senior management and the board. And nobody wants to be that person who goes up in front of the board. Why aren't we getting this done? The other aspect is that when you're considering a major outsourcing deal, if you work in financial services, you better make sure the board was briefed before the deal is done, because that's another aspect of it. So you can't just go out and say, I'm going to outsource this whole business function to third party A without knowledge and concurrence by the board. There has to be transparency.
Yep. A quick question. It takes, somebody sent in, it takes 2 years to change a vendor or a solution. How do you get out of a risk event with a supplier or change a vendor when it will take you 2 years?
Well,
I mean, I might say that's insane that it takes you.
Yeah, well, it does.
That's my,
It very simply has to do, if it's a strategic relationship, which is what this sounds like, that you have an exit plan. So you can outsource a process to a third party, but you can't outsource the knowledge you need to maintain to operate that process in a business. So there's a difference. I can outsource the process, but I better keep somebody around who knows how things actually work in case I need to bring it back in case I need to exit with that vendor. And for critical relationships, you should have, at least before you outsourced it, thought about an exit strategy and what you need to do if this doesn't work out. That's called planning.
Yeah, I mean, right. You just have to have the exit. If it takes 2, then you have to have a process, right? That
And if you don't have a process, it'll take you 2 years.
You might not be able to change it, but you better be able to operate within it. I mean, I guess,
Yeah.
right? Bob, we're up against it. Melissa, do we have a poll, another poll question? Are we good?
Yeah, we have one that we usually save till the end, but do you have anything else going on? We do have no more questions as of now, but they keep trickling in.
So, Bob, Melissa, why don't you call up the question? We can bang that one out, and then we'll save time to give Bob just kind of closing thoughts.
Sounds good. Yeah, this is the second poll. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this before. We're just curious to see if there is something you want to augment or establish in the TPRM world. I know 2023 budgets are getting cemented pretty soon, if not now. So let us know so we can follow up accordingly, and be honest, because we do follow up. It's not just for fun.
You won't hurt our feelings if you say no. If you say yes, there's a good chance Melissa might give you a phone call. So
yes, probably within the day.
Probably almost immediately, but
yeah, I'm calling you right now. But yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say, so guys, if you have spreadsheets and you're thinking about getting some automation, somebody asked a question around that. If you need some help either figuring it out, look, Bob, why don't you slap up your contact info too, so people have that. So if anybody, look, Bob's, if you need some guidance in terms of what to do, how to architect, how to build, I can't think of anybody who's better and has done it more with a lot of large companies. So, if you're not, if you're a little bit, Bob could probably offer you a lot of relevant advice and help you sell the benefits of a program. I'll give the 5-second on prevalent is if you need a platform, right, or managed services to help you do this. I think the cool thing is we have software that you can do this yourself. And we have a whole managed service team. So if you hate doing assessments as much as most people do, and bouncing that around, we can actually do that for you and just give you results. So that was the whole 12 seconds or like that. But Bob, back to you. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, when you think about the economic environment, and if we do end up heading in the direction of a recession and we don't have a soft landing, we can already see the financial constraints that are playing out across businesses and the layoffs, et cetera. So when we think about third-party risk, we have to think about what efficiencies we can bring to the table. And it is not efficient to have an endless flow of new third parties coming on. So structuring your inventory so that you understand what third parties actually do for you, both from a product perspective and from a risk perspective, understanding where duplication may occur to help the business leverage the existing relationships that you have, decreases the amount of exposure of your company and of your company's assets and data, and allows you at the same time to realize financial savings. So you decrease risk, you have financial savings, and in the context of how third parties continue to spiral up the number of outsourcing arrangements that companies are undertaking, you can play a key role in helping manage the expense growth that results from third parties being endlessly added, and reach out to your businesses, work with procurement to understand when things are coming down that do need to be done, so you can be an efficient partner and help onboard in support of your business and their goals, the key third parties that you need to get onboarded.
Great. Super solid advice for the last hour, folks. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Bob, thank you so much for doing this. And Melissa, I'll turn it back to you for any closing housekeeping stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I loved all the questions today, guys. That's what makes these webinars really fun. And I hope you appreciated the different format that we did today. And, I wish we could get to even more questions in the future, but Bob, Mike, you guys gave us some great insight of what to expect in the upcoming year. And I mean, that's it for me. I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thanks all. Speak soon.
Bye, guys.
Thanks much. Take
Bye,
care,
guys.
everyone. Good.